In today's episode of Gateway Books by Crestance, we step into a time of resistance and transformation, the 1960s and 70s. At the heart of our discussion is Kristin Hannah's The Woman, where a young nurse finds herself in the chaos of the Vietnam War. Through her journey, we witness the harsh realities of war and the even harsher reception awaiting female veterans upon their return to a divided homeland that overlooked their service. We then turn to Clara Bingham's The Movement, an immersive chronicle of the activists who took to the streets, campuses, and courtrooms to demand change. Finally, Doris Kearns Goodwin's An Unfinished Love Story offers a retrospective view revealing how the defining struggles of those decades continue to echo through history, shaping the way we see them today. Welcome to Gateway Books by Crestance, where one book is never enough and historical fiction is just the beginning. I'm Cindy Cruz, your guide through the dangerous intersection of literature and obsessive curiosity. This podcast is where fiction meets fact, because the best stories don't just transport us, they challenge us to look deeper. In the United States, the 1960s and 70s were decades of disruption, war, protest, and seismic shifts in society. It was a time when traditional roles were questioned, authority was challenged, and voices long ignored began demanding to be heard. The Vietnam War raged overseas, while back home the fight for civil rights, women's liberation, and anti-war resistance reshaped the cultural landscape. Fiction and history allow us to step into these moments, not just as observers, but as participants. Kristin Hannah's The Woman gives us Frankie McGrath, better known as Frankie, a young woman who enlists as an army nurse believing in service, duty, and country, only to find herself unprepared for the brutal reality of war and the indifference awaiting her return. Through her, we witness the untold stories of women who served, fought, and were forgotten. Meanwhile, Clara Bingham's The Movement transports us to the front lines of activism, where young people put their bodies, reputation, and futures on the line for justice. And Doris Goodwin's An Unfinished Love Story offers a perspective shaped by time. These books paint a portrait of a generation that dared push against the tide. And now, even decades later, their struggles still define the society we live in. When Frankie McGrath signed up as a nurse in The Woman, she was fueled by idealism. This deep-seated belief that she could do something meaningful, something that mattered. She grew up in a world where people like her, a privileged, well-mannered young woman from California, wasn't expected to step outside the lines. Very well, raise a family, maybe volunteer at a hospital if she wants to be useful. That's what her parents expected. But Frankie wanted more. She needed more. At first, she believed in the cause. She believed in service, in duty, in making a difference. But Vietnam didn't care about her good intentions. The moment she arrived, reality slammed into her. It was brutal and chaotic. Nothing like she imagined. She sees a young man, barely older than she is, torn apart by gunfire and explosions, their bodies broken beyond recognition. Some of them she can save. Many she can't. And she had to learn quickly how to keep going even after the worst night, after holding someone's hand as they take their last breath. Her idealism shatters piece by piece, replaced by something colder, mere survival. What keeps her grounded are the other nurses and friendships she builds in the middle of all that suffering. They become her family. They understood in a way no one else ever could. In a world that doesn't make sense, they are the only ones that do. And then the war ended. Except for Frankie, it didn't. She comes home expecting something. Recognition, acknowledgement, at the very least, a place to belong. When instead, she finds silence. No one wants to hear about Vietnam. And worse, no one even believes she was there. Women? That didn't happen. Even the men who fought struggled to be heard. And Frankie, she doesn't even get a chance to speak. The only ones who understood what she was going through were the friends she made in Vietnam. They know that the war isn't over just because you leave the battlefield. But even when then, it was hard. PTSD lives inside the skin. Some days she fought back. Some days it drowned her. Kristin Hannah doesn't just tell Frankie's story, she tells the story of so many forgotten women who served, sacrificed, and came home to nothing. But through Frankie, through the friendships that keep her afloat, we're reminded that even when history tries to erase people, their stories are real, and they deserve to be told. Hannah's book also lets us see how, while Frankie was stitching up soldiers and witnessing the horrors of war firsthand, another battle was raging. The country she left behind was shifting, though she didn't fully realize it. Protests filled the streets, campuses erupted in demonstrations, and the very idea of patriotism was being redefined. The war she was risking her life for, millions of Americans were fighting to end. By the time she returned home, it wasn't just the war that had changed. It was the entire country. And for many veterans like her, that made coming back even harder. They hadn't gone too long, and they had seen too much. The world they left behind had moved on without them. At the center of that upheaval were the young activists who refused to stay silent. Their fight wasn't on the battlefield, but in the streets, the courts, and the halls of power. They were part of a movement that would redefine an entire generation. And this is where we turn to Clara Bingham's The Movement, who explored the voices that stood against war, injustice, and the status quo. Voices that, like Frankie's, refused to be ignored. While the war raged on in Vietnam, another battle was being fought back home. But this one was about military strategy or foreign policy. It was about the fundamental rights of half the population. Women weren't just waiting for change anymore. They were demanding it. And they were doing it everywhere. In living rooms, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in newsrooms, classrooms, and on the streets. They were challenging laws, breaking barriers, and refusing to accept the status quo. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always welcomed. But they weren't backing down. Not every woman started out as an activist. Many had spent years feeling like something was off. Like they had done everything they were supposed to do, but still felt unfulfilled. And then in 1963, Great Freedom's The Feminine Mystic hit bookshelves. And suddenly, things started to click. Freedom called it the problem that has no name. That feeling of being trapped in a role that didn't fit. Of wanting more, but being told that wanting more was selfish or unnatural. Her book shattered the idea that women were happy as housewives and caregivers, and for millions of women, it was a wake-up call. And here's the thing. Society didn't want women to wake up. It wanted them to settle down. And if a woman wasn't happy with her life, there was a pill for that. By the mid-1960s, Value, then nicknamed Mom's Little Helper, was the most prescribed drug in America. It was marketed directly to housewives, to women who were exhausted, anxious, and depressed, but had no real outlet for their frustrations. Instead of changing the circumstances that were making women miserable, doctors handed out pills to help them tolerate it. Freedom's book made some women put down the Valium bottle and start asking hard questions. Why were they expected to dedicate their entire existence to serving others? Why were they being told they should be satisfied with so little? And why, if they weren't satisfied, was the answer sedation rather than change? Once women started asking these questions, it became impossible to stop. For some, the next step was realizing how little control they had over their own health. For generations, medical decisions had been made for women, not with. Doctors, almost always men, held the knowledge, and women were expected to simply follow orders. That's just the way it was. Then in 1970, a group of women in Boston decided they weren't going to wait around for the medical establishment to catch up. They put together Our Bodies Ourselves, a book that explained everything women had never been taught about their own anatomy, about birth control, about sexual health. And it wasn't written in cold technical language. It was direct, honest, and empowering. The message was clear. You deserve to know how your body works. You deserve to be taken seriously by doctors. You deserve to be the one in control. It was revolutionary. Women were starting to realize that their frustrations weren't personal failings. They were the result of a system built to keep them in place. And the more they learned, the harder it became to accept the way things had always been. At the same time, some women were taking the fight beyond their personal lives and straight into the legal system. Because even as society was changing, the law still saw men and women as anything but equal. Take Reed versus Reed, a Supreme Court case from 1971. It started with something that seems, well, a dispute over who could be the executor of an estate. But the law in Idaho was clear. If a man and a woman both applied, the man automatically got the job. No questions asked. Sally Reed was a grieving mother who challenged that law. And with the help of a young Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court ruled that gender discrimination violated the Constitution's equal protection laws. That ruling may not have grabbed headlines, but it was monumental. It was the first crack in the legal foundation that treated women as second-class citizens for centuries. It sent a clear message. The law had to start treating women as equals. And it wasn't the last fight Ruth Bader Ginsburg would take on. But the laws weren't the only thing that needed changing. Women's stories, real stories about real struggles, were still being ignored. For decades, women's magazines had been filled with beauty tips, household advice, and articles on how to keep a husband happy. But in 1972, Miss Magazine hit the shelves. Co-founded by Doris Kearns, Miss wasn't just a magazine. It was a platform. It tackled real issues: workplace discrimination, women in politics, the fight for equal pay. It gave feminists a national voice that couldn't be ignored or shoved into the women's section of the newspaper. By 1972, women weren't just shaping culture and law. They were pushing their way into politics. That same year, Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman to run for a major party's presidential nomination. She faced sexism, racism, and every possible form of pushback, but she refused to back down. Women weren't just asking for a seat at the table. They were pulling their own shares and making space. The changes that happened in the 60s and 70s didn't fix everything overnight. There was resistance, there were setbacks, and the fight for equality is still being fought today. But by the time the dust settled, the country had changed. Laws had changed, attitudes had changed, and women were no longer willing to be sidelined. The Vietnam War and the movements of the 60s and 70s weren't just history for Doris Goodwin. They were her life. She wasn't watching from the sidelines. She was inside the rooms where decisions were made, where power shifted, where history took shape in real time. Her memoir, An Unfinished Love Story, is a rare blend of personal experience and historical reflection. It's a story about politics, yes, but also love, both for a man and for a country in crisis. Through her relationship with her late husband, Richard Goodwin, a key figure in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, she revisits an era that shaped both their lives and the nation itself. This book offers something the other two don't: hindsight. The woman puts us in the trenches. The movement captures the fire of resistance, but Goodwin, she gives us a long view. As a young woman, Goodwin worked as a White House fellow under President Lyndon Johnson. She saw firsthand the weight of leadership, the impossible decisions, and the contradictions of a man trying to balance progress at home with an unwinnable war abroad. Johnson was a president of radical contradictions. He pushed through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, and the war on poverty, arguably one of the most progressive domestic agendas in history. And yet, his legacy remains overshadowed by Vietnam. Goodwin watched him struggle with that reality. She witnessed the growing divide between him and the young people he had once inspired, the ones who had believed in his vision of a great society, but turned against him as the war escalated. The chants of, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" weren't just political slogans. They were personal. Through her memoir, we see the human side of power, the isolation, the doubt, the way even the most powerful figures are shaped by the tides of history. What makes this book so compelling is the way Goodwin revisits these events, not just as a historian, but as someone who lived through them. She isn't just recounting facts. She's grappling with memory, with what it means to look back at a time that felt so immediate, so urgent, and to see it through the lens of decades gone by. This is something Frankie McGrath never gets in The Woman. When she returns home from Vietnam, she's stuck in the raw aftermath, trying to piece her life together while the world moves on. The same can be said for many activists in the movement. They were so caught up in the fight that they didn't have time to process what it all meant. But Goodwin, she has the luxury of time. And time changes how we see things. With her husband, she spent the latter years diving back into the archives, rereading letters, reliving the moments that had once defined them. What had they gotten right? What had they misunderstood? What had changed in the way history is remembered after all these years? This kind of reflection is crucial because it reminds us that history isn't static. What seems clear in the moment often looks different decades later. So much of this book is about understanding how the past continues to shape the present. The battles over civil rights, economic inequality, and foreign policy didn't end in the 70s. They evolved. The protests of the Vietnam era set the stage for modern activism. The political divisions that fractured the country then still exist today, just in different forms. The question of who gets to define patriotism, who has the right to protest, and what a country stands for, these are still being fought over. Because in the end, history isn't about policies and protests. It's about people. It's about the way relationships shape our view of the world and how the world in turn shapes those relationships. And the choices we make aren't just about politics. They're about the people we share our lives with, the ones who challenge us, push us, stand beside us through moments of triumph and moments of doubt. And that's where the author leaves us, not just with a reflection of the past, but with an understanding that history is never truly finished. The questions of the 1960s haven't disappeared. Some battles were won, some remain unfinished. Some lessons were learned, some have faded, waiting to be rediscovered. Looking back from a distance, Goodwin invites us to ask, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? And what still needs to be done? Some questions remain unanswered. Some stories remain unfinished. And maybe, just like history itself, they always will be. The Vietnam era was a time of reckoning. It forced people to question what they believed, who they trusted, and what their country stood for. Some, like Frankie, went to war believing they were serving noble cause, only to return home to a nation that had turned its back on them. Others, like the activists in the movement, risked everything to challenge a system that they saw as broken. And then there were those, like Goodwin, who had a front row seat to history and spent a lifetime trying to make sense of it. What these stories remind us is that there is no single truth about that era. There is only perspective, formed by where we stood, what we saw, and how we remember. And that's what makes history so powerful. It's not just about facts or dates. It's about people. It's about choices. It's about how the past refuses to stay in the past. Because in many ways, we are still asking the same questions today. How do we define service? What does a protest accomplish? And what do we owe those who fight in our name? And perhaps the hardest question of all, how will we be remembered? Thank you for joining us in Gateway Books by Crestance. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into history and the powerful stories that bring it to life. Before we go, don't forget to check out crestance.com, not just for more insights, but also for our amazing line of gear and home decor. If you're passionate about books and the reader lifestyle, you'll find pieces designed just for you. And of course, if you like this episode, hit that like button, subscribe, and share with fellow book lovers and history buffs. Your support keeps Gateway Books and Crestance going strong, and I can't wait to explore more stories with you. I'm Cindy Cruz. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.